Did you know that there are more reasons to travel than just rare cosmic alignments? I know, it was news to me too. But as I've been slowly broadening my horizons, and even managed to make it out of North America for the first time back in 2023, an exciting new destination was proposed from a very unsurprising source.
We should go to Venice!
So we got all our videos buffered and went to Italy for a week. Now normally I'm a solo traveler, which is simultaneously very freeing and very logistics heavy. But for this trip, I was happy to be what I believe the kids are calling a passenger princess. So instead of doing any of the heavy lifting, I got to hang out in the proverbial back seat, asking to stop at every proverbial McDonald's while the grown-ups actually got us from point A to point B. So, here to lay out the planned route and explain the logic therein is Mr. Vembis himself.
Thank you, Red. It's not every day your friends offer you carta bianca to plan a trip to Italy, so Cyan and I had a ball putting this together. The initial concept came from two very close friends who wanted to see Italy but didn't want to tag along with an unwieldy tour group nor go by themselves and plan it blind. So me being a professional historian and also their close personal friend meant we could strike that perfect balance of fun friend trip while also knowing what we're actually looking at. In this case with two more friends as we looped in Hello Future Me and his wife, bringing our crew to 7. But Italy is a dense place with plenty of pretty sights, so where to go and what to see? Essentially there are two ways to travel. You can zoom or you can vibe. To zoom is to jump from city to city and see as much as your frail mortal vessel will allow, whereas to vibe is to pick a place you like and make it your base, somewhere comfy, easy, fun, but still interesting enough to fill a week. Now, Venice is lovely, but La Serenissima is expensive, so we spent our week a brief 30-minute train ride west. Enter Padua, home to Italy's second oldest university and some big-ticket sites like St. Anthony's Basilica and Giotto Scrovegni Chapel, but critically, barely on the tourist circuit at all. I knew it from spending a summer semester abroad 10 whole years ago. Oh god, while Cyan spent an afternoon there a few years back. So with Padua as our base for the surrounding Veneto region, our plan was to alternate day trips and rest days before finishing with a weekend in Venice. Because Padua is lovely, but we'd be fools to cut out Venice entirely. Come on, it's Vembis! I'd be derelict in my duties as a Veneziaboo if I didn't instill the love of the Republic in my travel companions. But I'm getting ahead of myself, as the first thing was actually Cyan and I arriving a day before everyone else, so we took a lovely Saturday morning train ride to neighboring Vicenza, where we marveled at the marble and checked out the museum of my favorite Renaissance architect, Palladio. And let me tell you, gallery design got really good in the last dozen years. We went room by room through one of Palladio's own villas to understand him, his work, his city, and his broader place in Venetian history. I also got this stunning copy of a book I'd been chasing for years, Palladio's Quattro Libri di Architettura. So crisp it looked like it was printed that morning. I told myself I'd get an irresponsible amount of books on the trip, and judging by the fact that we bought a new checked luggage just for books, I'd say mission accomplished. But evening was on its way, and that meant our friends were too, so Cyan and I hopped back to Padua to welcome our passenger princesses.
Just as planned, the first place we set up camp was in Padua. This was my first time ever in Europe, which I think made me the only person in our traveling party who'd never been to that side of the pond before. So while everyone else was having nuanced opinions on things and pronouncing stuff correctly, I was the one going, "No way guys, the streets are so bendy!" We got in pretty late that first day, so we mostly just took a little tour of the Padua Centro, got our first of many gelatos, and passed the f*** out. The hotel we were staying in was absolutely gorgeous, and Blue informed me it was very funny that most of the decor was actually pictures of Florence. Then the next morning we got our first taste of the city when it was actually awake. The first thing that surprised me about Padua in specific, and apparently Europe in general, was how many people were smoking? Like cigarettes? Like it was the 1950s? So that was interesting. Fortunately, I like to travel with a face mask handy, which was extremely useful for not KOing myself with a secondhand smoke migraine on day one. The other thing I noticed is that I kept getting Italianed, as in cashiers kept talking to me in Italian rather than assuming I was a tourist, which was a bit of a problem because I do not speak Italian. I couldn't figure out what about me was screaming, "This lady is a local," until we realized that if the local pedestrians were any indication, the fashionable ladies' outerwear in Padua this season is wide leg or flare jeans and a black leather jacket worn either normally or slung over the shoulders Yu-Gi-Oh style. Which I was doing because my jacket has a fuck ton of pockets, which makes it great for traveling in, and I was king of gamesing it to avoid overheating. I have never in my life been fashionable, and I was not expecting to be fashionable here. But I guess statistically it had to happen somewhere. And on the subject of not speaking Italian, I don't, but I do have a passable understanding of Spanish, which has a lot of cognates in Italian. So I could pick up on a lot of basic words and interpolate the rest from context clues. So I ended up with this weird phenomenon where as the week went on and I was fully immersed in this language, I started understanding it kind of? It's hard to explain. It's like it bypassed the part of my brain that needed to translate it into English and went straight to the getting the gist of it part, which was honestly extremely cool because I have had a lot of trouble with language learning in the past, and it was kind of really neat to feel like I was picking up on it fast for once. Also, the language barrier was never a huge problem because Blue actually speaks Italian, and Cyan was having the same Romance language indirect translation experience as I was, but via French, and almost everybody we talked to spoke at least some English, and honestly, it's shocking how much you can communicate just with tone and hand gestures in a pinch. So overall, the language barrier was not an issue, which was good because that was something I'd honestly been pretty worried about. This was my first time traveling to a country where I didn't speak at least one of the major languages, and that was a bit of a daunting prospect. Of course, the funny thing about that is that anything written in English in Italy was, by its nature, aiming at a target audience of English-speaking tourists. So one of the ways we were avoiding low-quality tourist traps was steering clear of any place that had too much English signage. It was a fun little paradox to navigate, but Blue was much too excited about trying his hand at Italian after a decade of not practicing it regularly, so he played point for most group interactions in any location that wasn't clearly Englished, before turning back to the rest of us to quietly celebrate that he, quote, clutched it. And speaking of navigation, I developed a couple dubious habits while we were out and about, because a lot of the areas we went through were packed with tourists and pedestrians who weren't always paying the most attention to, for instance, Cyan's wheelchair trying to navigate through an extremely wheelchair-inaccessible 500-year-old cobblestone street. So when a scusa and a scusate turned out to not be enough for most people, I just started going beep beep. Which in my defense worked, and it crossed the language barrier very handily. I just really needed to train myself out of doing that as soon as I got back to the States. Our first full day in Padua, we did a big picnic in the Prato della Valle, a huge oval public park ringed by statues of various famous dead guys. As an American, I was a little shocked at how pleasant and welcoming the public space was. Most American public areas are designed to be pretty to look at, but uncomfortable to hang out in to discourage loitering, aka the terrible crime of hanging out. So it was kind of a nice, pleasant shock to see people just chilling, napping, picnicking, and having a grand old time with no fear of getting shooed off. Also, this was my first exposure to the architectural design phenomenon of, hey, why does that thing have feet? Then we were going to check out the Basilica of San Antonio, but the ladies of the group unfortunately had scandalously bared shoulders and maybe even a couple knees, so we couldn't make it past the front door. That's okay, we'd be back. Foreshadowing is a literary device. Showing admirable restraint, we had a whole 18 hours in Padua before we took our first trip down to Venice for a water taxi ride down the Grand Canal, an evening stroll, and a nice dinner. And boy oh boy, Boat Town was ready to deliver. It was quite a change from Padua, which felt broadly very residential. It's not like there weren't any tourists, but it was mostly people just living there, running businesses, going to supermarkets, heading to and from class, etc. Venice does not feel like that. Venice feels a little more like a theme park. Its primary selling point is basically the novelty of the world building of an entire artificial island city. And it was very full of tourists and people trying to sell stuff to tourists, although they basically all dispersed less than a block out from St. Mark's Square, giving way to much quieter streets and a borderline peaceful vibe. Unfortunately, navigating Venice was a bit of a pain in the ass in one specific regard: extremely inconsistent wheelchair accessibility. Most of the island blocks are connected by bridges, which are, for the most part, stepped bridges, although the area around St. Mark's Square has a lot of ramps installed for exactly this reason, to make things easier for wheelchair users or people with strollers, etc. However, this specific one was kind of on us. See, our dinner reservation was for a lovely little restaurant off the beaten path called La Trattoria alla Scala, which is the stair restaurant, which turned out to have stairs. Lots of them. We made it work with outdoor seating and the food was delicious, but it did spawn a running gag for the rest of the week about Stair Restaurant, the restaurant with all the stairs. Anyway, with the first full day done, we made our way back to Padua for a good night's sleep and a beautiful morning breakfast before we headed to our second day trip destination, fair Verona, where we lay our scene. Verona was another interesting contrast with Padua and Venice. It was a smidge more touristy than Padua, but not by much. Its main feature was the absolutely massive fuck-off Roman ruins in the middle of everything. They had a full Colosseum right by the outdoor cafe we got a pizza lunch in. They had the historical Roman city walls just there, butting up against modern buildings like it wasn't even a thing. Of course, none of this is Verona's real claim to fame. That honor goes to Romeo and Juliet, which is of course the branding on 100% of the city's souvenirs and tourist traps, including the famous Juliet's Balcony, which was the only part of the city absolutely mobbed with tourists, and oh baby, it's not worth it. It's a random balcony assigned assigned to a fictional character who never existed. But it did spawn off another trip-running gag about how every time we spotted a balcony, especially one with some of the nice floral decoration which Italy has in abundance, we'd all marvel at how, OMG, it's the real actual Juliet's balcony, no way! The next day, back in Padua, we started checking out some of the local sites, starting with the Scrovegni Chapel, which was absolutely covered in beautiful frescoes of various Christian stories, including a huge depiction of the torments of hell. This guy's my favorite. Then we headed to the Museo Eremitani to admire the art, artifacts, and their own personal Stargate. Then we made our way to the University of Padua for the grand tour of the place Galileo used to teach, the operating theater where they did some of the first legal dissections, and of course the statue dedicated to their first female student, Elena Piscopia, who was the first woman in history to get an official university degree. Although she was, of course, forbidden from studying theology because the cardinal in charge of the school said she had too much boob to get that close to God, so she had to study philosophy instead. And sass aside, I thought this was actually kind of an interesting point I hadn't really seen brought up before, which is that Elena going to university was a big groundbreaking deal, but her previous education wasn't. Her father had hired her private tutors to help facilitate her passion for knowledge and learning, which was apparently not seen as anywhere near as big of a deal as her enrollment in the university. When we see the story of the first woman to get a university degree getting so much press and statuary about it, it kind of gives the passive impression that every other woman in history up to this point was denied any sort of education and trapped in a morass of ignorance by the unjust prejudices of her day. But a formal university education was the exception for everyone and not the rule. Tutors and freelance teachers seem to have been the main way people seeking an education got taught, and that wasn't a no girls allowed boys club of excellence. I don't know, it was a minor point, but I thought it was neat, and it reframed some of the way I thought about the history of education. Also, this was our first time experiencing a specific little bit of fun cognitive dissonance about Italian history, because a lot of the parts of this university were quickly described by the tour guide as being created in the 1930s by some important government person or another. It probably doesn't really matter. I mean, Italy in the 1930s. Surely Italy and its government wasn't getting up to anything bad in the 1930s. Surely there's no reason the tour guides glossed over that part so fast. Blue developed a bit of a spidey sense for this specific little bit of sleight of hand over the week where he'd glance at a random building, look suspicious, say, that looks a little 1930s-y, then promptly Google it and say, God damn it. This happened daily. Thanks, Italy. The next day was the real hoist. It was a full-day trip to Florence, and it started around 5 a.m. We hopped on the train in time to watch the sunrise, got cozy for the long haul, and made our way out to the city of Dome. Okay. Fucking 64 times the charm. Any minute now, this is gonna move out of the way and I'll be able to see the beautiful mountains. Cool. Oh wow, that was so beautiful. God fucking damn it. Our first stop was the Uffizi Gallery, which was locked up tighter than Fort Knox in the security department, but honestly I can't blame them, they had a lot of fancy stuff in there. Full disclosure, this morning was a little rough on me. I like museums in concept, but I usually go through them pretty fast. My attention span doesn't like reading all the signs, my feet don't like standing still for too long, and we hadn't had time for much of a breakfast on our way out. So I spent a lot of this museum visit finding the nearest bench and waiting for everyone else to be done. That's not the Uffizi's fault, that's just a me problem. Once I got some coffee and gelato in me, I had a much better time. We got jump scared by the Duomo during our walk, which truly cannot be overstated how weirdly enormous it is. And then we went to a place called Signor Vino for lunch, which had an absolutely goddamn gorgeous view of the river and the bridge packed with market stalls, as well as the mountains in the distance. Straight up, 10 out of 10 experience. Also, the food was nice. Also, the name means Mr. Wine, the world-building implications of which are delightful. And come on, we gotta pay our respect to the Signor. Then we stopped into the Medici Mausoleum, which was, bluntly, the most beautiful room I've ever seen. The whole thing was floored and walled with inlaid semi-precious stones cut into close-fitting jigsaw shapes, and it was absolutely gorgeous. The walls at eye level featured the crests of all 16 cities in the Medici domains, and also this horse had a fun surprise bonus feature. Then it was time to get a closer look at that Duomo using a Pro Strat courtesy of Cyan. We could pay the entry fee and wait in line for over an hour to come in as tourists and get all our pretty pictures that way, or we could just attend evening mass for free. This was an interesting experience for me because half my family is Jewish, I'm not Christian of any kind, I've never been to mass before, and the guys in charge did the whole thing in Italian anyway, so I didn't follow a word of it. I spent the whole time doodling mermaids. However, I'd been on my feet for basically 12 unbroken hours and my feet weren't happy about it, so when I learned that you had to spend a lot of mass standing up, waiting for the guy to stop doing the everyone has to be standing for this part spiel, my assessment of the experience rapidly deteriorated. Partially my fault for not packing more comfortable shoes, views, but once that was over, we got to do a little meandering around the inside of the church, admire all the pretty paintings, and bypass the whole tourism problem in the process. For my pains, I also acquired a festive souvenir from a big official-looking wooden box of tea lights freely available for use in prayer of some sort, which I learned later from Cyan I probably should not have taken. But we eventually agreed that we could call it reparations for the Vatican still holding onto the menorah and also, all the other stuff. I was kindly asked to not steal from any more churches, and I solemnly swore not to take anything that had a price tag, which is basically the same thing, but much funnier. We got dinner in the Centro Storico with a killer view of the very domes we'd been discussing, and caught the last express train back to Padua. Florence Day was a huge hoist, physically and sleep schedule-wise, so we took the next day very easy. We mostly spent it hanging out or walking around some of the beautiful avenues of Padua before we converged on the Basilica of San Antonio to take a walking tour through our second beautiful church in 2 days. The place was very pretty, and I especially liked how the arched ceilings were covered in a navy blue night sky studded with golden stars. Very classy. I also seem to recall that every church had a basin of holy water just out in the open, with no price tag. So naturally, I pulled out one of my handy-dandy little glass vials I always travel with to fill up an ounce of that extra holy St. Anthony water, and pocketed it mere moments before Cyan appeared and asked me very nicely to not steal from another church, or to at least not tell her about it until we were no longer inside the church. Which was completely fair, but it did put me into a very funny bind for the rest of the visit. And for the record, I didn't get in trouble for this one. Apparently, the holy water is actually free for the taking. I just thought I was maybe doing crime. I couldn't help it, the bit was too funny. For dinner, we availed ourselves of pizza al cubo, or the famous cube pizza, and we had a delicious time of it before the rain rolled in and we had to skedaddle. What a glorious feeling, I'm lost in the rain. The next day, it was time to say goodbye to Padua and hello again to Venice. The last couple days of our trip were going to be spent wholly in Venice, seeing the sights, trying the food, riding the boats, and not falling into the canals. Not even once. I couldn't believe it. We stowed our bags at the hotel and got lunch at a place called Vino Vino, which has set my new standard for hot chocolate in the most obnoxious way. Yeah, sorry guys, Swiss Miss and water won't cut it with me anymore. It just can't compare to this one cup of hot chocolate I had in Venice. Anyway, the place was really good, and I love how many of these restaurants had outdoor seating in a kind of secluded walled courtyard behind the restaurant. All the benefits of the fresh air and outdoors, but you're also mostly in the shade and very rarely get shit on by birds. After we got properly checked into the hotel, the rest of the party immediately headed out for another big walk, while Cyan and I stayed in to rest up before heading for the Piazza San Marco. It was by far the most tourist-dense part of the city, but that meant a lot of nice open-air cafe seating and live music, which we paid €7 each for the privilege of sitting and listening to, and a nice drinks menu of fancy coffees, which we paid twice as much for than at any previous cafe. Then for dinner, we made our way to a nearby hotel for high tea, which is by far my favorite and most expensive bad habit. I just can't resist a good stack of tiny sandwiches. And this was probably one of the best high teas I've ever had. The food was delicious, the service was excellent, the room was immaculate. Holy cannoli! Am I allowed to say that? And they sat us on the far side of the room in a square of couches and armchairs, so we got to hang out in there for like 3 hours. It ruled. After we finished up and digested a little, we took a leisurely meandering walk back to the hotel and started on our favorite game of the tail end of the trip. Spot the winged lions. The rules were simple. If you're the first one to spot a winged lion in the local decor and you dibsy it, you get to add it to your personal score. I ended the trip with a final count of 7, and I did not win. These quieter parts of Venice were very peaceful and very beautiful, which made a nice change from the extremely tourist-dense bits we'd been frequenting. That said, Venice never really felt alive to me. Whenever we took the water taxis, I'd make a little note of how many buildings we passed with a rotted front door or no lights in the windows. The high water line was clearly high enough to have done some serious structural damage to some of the buildings, and not all of them had been repaired or even maintained. The impression I got was that Venice was less a living city than it was a monument to its own world-building appeal. People come to Venice because there's nowhere else like Venice, but that's because Venice is something you only make if you have no other choice. It's just too unstable and too inconvenient for most people to want to stay there, so the economy feels like it's entirely built on tourism now. And as a tourist, going to a place like that feels a little bit like you're a big juicy steak. The next day, we went to the fanciest place of them all, the Doge's Palace. And boy howdy was this place fancy! Even before it got turned into a museum, it was already jam-packed with frescoes and gilding. I'd noticed something interesting about a lot of the places we'd visited so far. Lots of them had illusion paintings curves on the walls or ceiling. The University of Padua had illusion painting statue niches on the ceilings of the lecture hall, making it look like they were full of marble statues and complex carvings. Even the Scrovegni Chapel had painted fake marble paneling onto the walls. It wasn't until we visited the Medici Mausoleum, with the walls literally covered in precisely carved and polished semi-precious stone, that I understood what kind of ludicrous, ostentatious wealth these illusion paintings were imitating in fresco and plaster. The projected aesthetic of wealth is always based on imitating the means and capabilities of the actually ludicrously wealthy. When we went to the Doge's palace, I realized I hadn't seen anything yet. This place was beyond massive, and it seemed even bigger on the inside somehow. Statues everywhere, arches everywhere, carved marble wall panelings like the illusion paintings we've been seeing everywhere. Every ceiling carved and gilded, every square inch of free space painted with something. Even the benches were official important historical benches, not for sitting. The Doge's palace had a couple illusion painted fake statue niches, but I'm convinced those are only there because the wall was too thin to accommodate an actual statue niche. Or the ones painted on the ceiling are there because it's kind of hard to securely mount a statue to a ceiling. I mean, it's not like they couldn't afford the statues. Also, they have this one statue of Adam that was really weirdly proportioned. Like, the model was clearly a very slender, lanky dude, and then just BAM! Double-cheeked up on a Wednesday for no reason. Of course, no tour of the Doge's palace would be complete without the jail, so we got to cross the Bridge of Sighs both ways. But the day wasn't done, because we had another bit of fun fantasy world building on the docket, the island of Murano, famous for its glass. An artificial island of glassmakers. That is some straight-up fantasy bullshit world building, and I love it. We stopped for a delicious gelato break, which came with a fun and funky hidden message, checked out the glass museum, and learned a lot about historical glassmaking techniques. Picked up some very cute stuff from the stores.
Oh my god, you guys, we found him. The real Sonic the Hedgehog.
And just generally browsed.
Kowalski, 5 chips.
I really liked Murano. It felt a lot more alive than the rest of Venice I'd seen. Unlike the area of St. Mark's Square being propped up by crappy knickknacks and servicing/scamming tourists, I didn't get that big juicy steak vibe from any of it. Murano actually made stuff, and it felt like the glassmakers of Murano would happily go on glassmaking whether or not I was there to buy their adorable tiny fish bowls. Our initial dinner plans fell through a little, so we finally paid homage to Aeneas & Co. by finding a hole-in-the-wall pizzeria that seriously would have felt perfectly at home in central Manhattan, and just absolutely going to town on 3 pizza pies. And if there's a more appropriate way to close out my first time in Italy, I don't know what it is. I think the best thing about travel is that it lets you get in a lot of new first times. Travel of all kinds, I mean, not just big ocean crossings. Even if you're just going off the beaten path in your hometown, there's a new angle on the world to be found there, a new coffee shop to stop into, a new bird to spot, a new sunset to admire. This was my first time in Europe, my first time going full immersion in a completely new language, my first up-close look at what it used to mean to have a palace. I could feel my writing and world-building brain taking frantic notes on everything as I internalized and experienced a new way a slice of the world could work. Like, oh, this kind of city layout is where you get the trope of the high-octane rooftop chase scene. It's so ubiquitous, but I always thought it was a little implausible with double-wide city streets and driveways between every house, or, you know, skyscrapers. But this is the kind of city that trope was made for and forged in. And there were aesthetic elements of the city, visual design language that surprised me in interesting ways that made me realize some biases I had. In the US, if a building is old, it's generally regarded with a smidge of mistrust. Newer, shinier, cleaner buildings are seen as kind of more trustworthy and comfortable to be in, even if they had to zone for them by bulldozing a national landmark to get there. I got none of that vibe from the cities we visited. A building could be old and visibly graffitied and have half a Roman wall sticking out of it and still feel alive and in use and comfortable and safe. Old things weren't replaced, they were updated. Sometimes not all the way to the standards of comfort and accessibility we were used to, but it made me realize how much I was accustomed to places that were broadly untrusting of the past and fixated on progress. And I think that's inextricable from the fact that I grew up in the US. The US has a long history, and the territory that got turned into the US has a significantly longer one. But aside from a few founding fathers and landmark namesakes that get top press and billing, there's a pretty strong vibe in the US that the past is a theoretical thing that happens elsewhere. You could almost get the impression that the United States maybe finds huge swaths of of its own past so unconscionable that its only recourse is to believe that the past cannot ever have a meaningful impact on the present. So it's not worth thinking about because it doesn't matter, because if it did, we'd have way too much shit to answer for. This distancing of the past feels impossible to maintain in Europe. The past is literally butting up against the present on every street corner, laid down with the cobblestones, scribed into the university walls, carefully preserved with the 1930s furniture. It's not just the flattened foundations supporting all the shiny new construction. The bones of every major building are like 700 years old. It was strange for me to go somewhere where the past is so present. I've never spent so much time in a place where it felt like history couldn't be ignored. I'm sure plenty of these grand revelations of mine sound hella obvious and banal, but that's just because I can't really explain how it felt to see it all click. There's a difference between knowing something intellectually versus experiencing it. When it's just you and that new facet of reality with nothing in between to cushion or shield you, you notice parts of it nobody would have thought to explain, and you draw connections that nobody would have told you. I knew the world was big. I knew it was complicated. I just kept getting pleasantly surprised at how many more surprises there were.
Every day the world begins again, sunny skies or rain. Come and follow me. Every sunrise shows me more and more, so much to explore. Come and follow